I welcome the opportunity to address the situation in Gaza, which remains an issue of profound concern and indeed horror for this government, this House and the people of Ireland. It's now over 12 months since this House adopted a motion in the aftermath of the attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups against Israel on the 7th of October 2023. And at that time we unreservedly condemned these brutal attacks, which indiscriminately and systematically targeted civilians, resulting in over 1,200 deaths. And we called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and, as a Dáil, for immediate and unimpeded humanitarian access to meet the urgent needs of all civilians in Gaza. We underlined that Israel must act within international law, stressing the universal applicability of international law, including international humanitarian law. These priorities have been and remain central to the government's approach. Our leadership and work with like-minded partners place these issues at the centre of the European Union and United Nations agenda. In the 12 months since, the horror and despair has deepened. An agreement on a ceasefire and hostage release deal has not been achieved. There have been over 43,000 more deaths in Gaza alone, where the level of destruction and human suffering is truly horrific and completely unacceptable, and Israel's war on Gaza is beyond any moral compass. We are witnessing the collective punishment of an entire population and the destruction of the entirety of Gaza itself. And in northern Gaza, terrible atrocities are being committed, and essentially involving the forced removal of the population from that part of Gaza. And I repeat, an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and a surge of humanitarian assistance into Gaza must remain the urgent focus of the international community. While our discussions today are focused on Gaza, we continue to face the risk of even wider regional escalation, which would have devastating consequences for the innocent people of the region as a whole. This is a trajectory that is deeply troubling and must be reversed. Given the gravity of the issue under discussion today, I want to be clear that the government will continue to pursue policies and initiatives that have a real and meaningful impact on the realities faced by the Palestinian people and take full account of the overall political and legal landscape. Effective leadership on foreign policy issues means bringing others with us and ensuring that our actions have a relevance beyond the domestic sphere. I stand over the government's record in this regard. Our principled position of tireless advocacy and considered actions is appreciated by Palestine and by our like-minded partners in Europe and indeed in the region. I would say to the Deputy Concerned, go and ask Palestinians, go and ask the Palestinian Authority their perception of Ireland's stance, and go and ask the Arab world in terms of their perception of the Irish government's stance. And it's a very unequivocal, positive one, yes. And they wish that others would do more. And I think the clear message from my extensive engagement with international partners who have expressly welcomed the approach of the government is that we sustain it and keep it going. These efforts are continuing as we speak. As this House is aware, steps are being taken by the Israeli Parliament against UNRWA, which could bring about the collapse of the entire humanitarian response in Gaza, which rests on UNRWA's infrastructure. The government is working within the European Union, as well as with a core group of like-minded states at the United Nations, to explore all possible political and legal avenues to protect the role placed by the UN Relief and Works Agency. This is consistent with the government's steadfast support for UNRWA in the face of continuing and systemic actions from the Israeli government. This political support was further underscored by the immediate provision of an additional €20 million of support for UNRWA earlier this year, announced in the presence of Commissioner General Lazzarini during his visit to Dublin in February. And this leadership at a critical juncture had a material impact on the approach of other donors, including the European Union. Now that's real action, that had real impact, that changed the direction of travel in Europe towards UNRWA. No question about that, and Ireland led on that. Very impactful for the people of Palestine. That has to be acknowledged. Ireland's recognition of the state of Palestine was a deeply significant moment in our bilateral relations with Palestine and a clear signal to the rest of the world of Ireland's solidarity at a time of immense despair for the Palestinian people. I've already set out the government's approach in detail to this House last May. And what I wish to underline at this point is that the timing and context of this decision was carefully calibrated with other partners to build momentum behind the Arab peace plan and implementation of the two-state solution. This momentum has continued in recent months, including through the launch of the Global Alliance for Implementation of the Two-State Solution during United Nations High-Level Week last September. This will include several follow-up meetings at senior official level, the first of which took place last week. Let me stress, our decision to recognise the State of Palestine was a national prerogative, fulfilling a commitment in the programme for government. However, the government's decision was taken to ensure a strategic approach and a meaningful impact on the international landscape. There has been a renewed focus on the Occupied Territories Bill over recent weeks, and I welcomed the opportunity to brief the Dáil Select Committee on Foreign Affairs on the government's approach on Tuesday. And as I have stated, the advisory opinion delivered by the International Court of Justice has changed the legal context. The Deputy ignored that in her contribution for the bill. And what has not changed is the European Union's exclusive competency in the field of trade for all its member states, including Ireland. And it's against this background that the Taoiseach asked the Attorney General to provide updated advice in relation to this bill. And in light of the new context provided by the advisory opinion, the government has decided to progress the bill and to prepare amendments. As I set out to the committee on Tuesday, the amendments required are not merely technical in nature. The government's analysis is that substantive amendment will be required to most, if not all, of the bill's provisions to try to bring it into line with EU law and our own constitution while prohibiting imports from the occupied territories. This has been acknowledged by the sponsors of the bill. It's not that it's so-called unconstitutional. It is unconstitutional. No one's arguing with that. And those measures have to be amended. What I want to emphasise in particular here, though, is that the ICJ advisory opinion did not somehow drop from the sky. Again, the opposition have ignored this, or some of the opposition have. The government strongly supported the request by the General Assembly for this advisory opinion in December of 2022. The government contributed actively to the proceedings through its written submission in July 2023 and the oral submission made by the Attorney General to the Court in February of this year. Ireland's core objective in making submissions in this case was to encourage the Court to clarify the rights of the Palestinian people in international law, and the opinion of the Court largely confirmed the government's own legal analysis. Far from using the issue as a domestic political football, the changed legal context that has given rise to further consideration of the Occupied Territories Bill has emerged from a process supported and shaped by the contributions of this government. As I've made clear on this issue repeatedly, the government intends to file a declaration of intervention in the case initiated by South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention at the International Court of Justice. The House will recall that it has always been the government's intention to file this declaration after South Africa has filed its memorial in the case. We understand that South Africa filed its memorial last week. Israel has until the July 28, 2025 to file its counter-memorial. As the government has made clear on previous occasions, the purpose of interventions by a state in cases such as these is to argue for its interpretation of the convention in question. The government's decision to intervene in the South African case was based on detailed and rigorous legal analysis. We're serious about this. We're serious about this legally. And we've done it properly. And I remember all the noise a year ago. You weren't doing this, you weren't doing that. Everything I said back then when this was raised in the House has proven to be true, and has come true. And the government's, we're a strong supporter of the work of the court, and we're deeply committed to international law and accountability. And we're also committed to support and promote an interpretation of the Genocide Convention to ensure the highest level of protection possible for civilians caught up in situations of armed conflict, and to apply the highest standards of conduct on those engaged in conflict. At my direction, work is progressing on the preparation of Ireland's Declaration of Intervention, which it is intended will be filed before the end of this year. In formulating this declaration, Ireland will set out a robust basis for its intervention before the court. It is then a matter for the court to rule on its admissibility. And we want to test that Genocide Convention. We want to broaden its interpretation to encompass what's happening in Gaza. And that has been a very considered approach by the legal team within my department. And subject to the court's ruling, Ireland would then make substantive submissions to the court on the proper interpretation of the Genocide Convention. And this is precisely the same approach followed in our intervention in the case of Ukraine versus Russia. In that instance, provisional measures were ordered by the court in March of 2022, and Ukraine filed this memorial in July of 2022. Ireland made its declaration of intervention in September 2022, and in both cases we've made timely interventions consistent with the ICJ's ruling. If I could just for the next minute, if I could, because I think it's an important issue. We have done so in a considered matter, having regard to the gravity of the facts at issue in each case and a detailed assessment of the applicable legal standards. This is not only to ensure the success of our arguments, but able to maintain Ireland's well-earned reputation as a serious and respected voice in support of the international legal Ireland order. The government has been extremely concerned at the conduct of both parties to this conflict. We've consistently stressed that both must respect international law, including international humanitarian law. And Israel and Hamas must be held accountable for violations of international humanitarian law committed. And all parties to armed conflict, states and non-states alike, have obligations under international law, and any actions contrary to these obligations are unacceptable and must be held to account. Could I just say quickly, in terms of dual-use licences, there's a number of issues in the motion. Ireland regulates the export of dual-use items fully in line with our international obligations, including the EU's dual-use regulation and the EU's common position. We've set out clear policies and procedures that pertain to overflights of sovereign airspace. There are procedures and a legal framework there. We don't facilitate anything in terms of as being alleged. And on the questions of sanctions, we participate in European sanctions and sanctions adopted by the United Nations Security Council or by the European Union. And we've been particularly active on the sanctions front, particularly against the violent Israeli settlers this year, and the EU have adopted sanctions, and we continue to press for that also. The one aspect I would say, Ireland is broadly, across society, supported. I think language that the government is somehow complicit in genocide here is reprehensible. I regret that that was said by Deputy Kearns.
And by Deputy Gannon as well.
It's really almost trying to exploit the crisis to try and have a political.
We're signatories to a Prevention of Genocide Convention.
I genuinely think
Prevention of Genocide.
And that's why.
That's what we signed. Preventing Genocide.
I think what we're trying to do in the court is important here, because
if we can succeed, things.
If we can succeed legally in broadening and getting the court to broaden how it interprets the Genocide Convention,
and what will be left of Gaza when you do that?
Denial of humanitarian access into Gaza. I think it will be a very effective day's work by Ireland. And I'm willing to share with our legal team with you.
You tell me all the time
I want to build consensus here and a proper approach to this issue. Thank you. Thank you, Cahill.
5 minutes.